the muscles in his neck and shuffled his ass on the wooden bench. LA courtrooms weren't built for comfort. The public gallery was rammed full, and it had been that way since day one of the trial. There was plenty of local interest in the case, but few people had more emotionally invested in the outcome than him. The room was dark, the atmosphere was somber. Oak paneling covered the walls while a skillful tile floor ran underfoot. Wooden fixtures and fittings abounded, and they looked like oak too. A small forest had been cut down to outfit this place. There was no windows, which meant no natural light and no outside distractions. Instead, strip lights flickered overhead and their low wattage output bathing the room in a sickly glow. Lunch recess was all over, and the air was alive with the gentle hum of hundred murmured conversation, but Hunter was silent, his mouth too dry to talk. Ahead of him, on the other side of the railing that separated the general populace from the business end of the room, were attorney's table. To the left, the defense. To the right, the prosecution. 8 people were present, but Hunter only had eyes for one. He stared at the back of the defendant's head, his jaw set firm. Carlos Montero, Salvadorian immigrant, kidnapper, pornographer, dead man walking. On trial for the abduction and murder of 7 kids, and also responsible for screwing up Hunter's life. If looks could kill, Senor Montero would have required the immediate services of an undertaker. The Salvadorian have been in the movie business, the snuff business. He'd plucked homeless kids from the city's darkness recess, pumped them full of crack, then locked them in a room with nothing but a cheap video camera and a 6'6", 300-pound pedophile named Bones for company. 6 children had gone missing over a period of 3 months, each one resurfacing in a dumpster, their broken bodies tossed away like so much trash. Hunter had worked the case harder than he'd ever worked any case before, putting in hour after hour, week after week, month after month, until time ceased to have any meaning, until life itself ceased to have any meaning other than bringing down the killer. He'd become obsessed, working himself beyond exhausting, until even sleep had failed to provide any refuge. His night haunted by visions of the children's violated bodies, their screams of agony ringing in his ears each time he awoke. He'd kept a bucket by his head and also at the brim of his bed as he'd started each day by hacking up the contents of his stomach. His subconscious, desperate to purge itself of the horrors of the night before, and the fucking days, were even worse than the night. Constant detective work with no clear leads, going from pillar to post without direction, feeling like nothing more than a fraud with a badge, all the while waiting for that terrible moment when another young body will be found stashed in the same back valley. Also, tracking down the victim's family to deliver the terrible news, attending funeral where lines of sobbing mourners watched tiny caskets being lowered into the ground, then waiting for the whole damn cycle to start up again. But just when he'd thought he might finally crack under the pressure, the abduction of Julie Delmar had broken the case wide open. She'd run away from home after a row with her stepfather and had been missing for 2 days. When the calls had started to come in, just 2 days. When she's quite home, her clothes had been clean, her hair had been tied in neat brushes, and her freckled face had been devoid of grim. Compared to the other street kids, she'd have stood out enough to be seen, enough to be remembered. Witnesses placed her buying a foot-long chili dog from a street vendor on Sunset, cadging for loose change outside Grauman's, and being bundled into the back of a white panel truck on Franklin. One sharp cookie had the foresight to make a note of the truck license plate, a plate that had led first to the pedophile bonds and then to Montero. The Salvadorian had initially denied all knowledge of Julie Delmar's whereabouts, but after 30 minutes of gentle persuasion, his memory had returned. He'd led Hunter to a derelict steelworks on the edge of town, and once inside, up a flight of steel steps and along a walkway to what had for merely been the foreman's office. The windows had been boarded up, the wooden door padlocked top and bottom. Approaching sirens had begun to ring out their clarion call as Hunter had burst into the room to find Julie lying peacefully on a middle-strained mattress. She'd looked for all the world like she was asleep, but this was one nap she wouldn't be waking up for. Hunter had been too late. The memories of that day continued to haunt him. How he'd been so damn close to saving Julie's life but had still come up short. How he'd cradled the young girl's body in his arms, her eyes glassed over, her pale skin cold to the touch. How he'd failed her, how someone had to pay. He watched as Montero lifted and also shifted around in his seat to look back over the courtroom. The Salvadorian bearded eye flitted from person to person until they finally met Hunter's unwavering stare. The wound of that guilty man's face remained prominent, a broken nose that kinked sharply to the left, a gap where his two front teeth had once resided. Hunter's blood began to boil. This case wasn't business, it was strictly personal. Just when he thought his fury had peaked, the Salvadorian tossed him a wide grin and turned back to his attorney. Hunter's rough hands belled into fists. He forced himself to take 10 deep breaths, just like the bullshit anger management classes had taught him, then looked back to find that Montero's attorney was whispering into her client's ears. She was an attractive woman somewhere in her early 30s, wearing a black business suit with crisp white blouse beneath. Powered dresser, her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and there was a pair of designer glasses patched on her freckled nose. The freckle made her look young and innocent. Hunter suspected she was anything but. Her name was Rebecca Finch, and she'd led the prosecuting attorney on a merry dance thus far, objecting almost every time he'd had the audacity to open his mouth. She'd thrown doubt on the credibility of witnesses, argued that evidence was circumstantial or inadmissible, and bamboozled the jurors with so many legal technicalities that their head was swimming with jargon by the end of each day. She'd made the case against the Salvadorian look weak. The confession that Hunter had beaten out of his man hadn't been worth the paper it had been written on. Even the fact that Montero had led him to the very steelworks where the girl's body had been found had counted for nothing. Everything was inadmissible, and his interrogation techniques was adjudged to have been overly energetic. The review board had called it use of excessive force just before they stripped him on his badge and shown him the door. So there was a lack of hard evidence. Montero had been careful to distance himself from the operation, leaving Bones to take all the risks. It was Bones who left a mattress soaked with DNA evidence at the steelworks. Bones Hood left his fingerprints on the digital video camera, and Bones Hood stared in the snuff movie found on the camera's memory card. Montero's Salvadorian hands were clean, and Finch had played on that Salvadoran angle, hinted that institutionalized racism was at work, suggested that her clients might not have been in this situation if it hadn't been for his cultural background. She'd made him look good on the stand, his facial wounds suggesting victims rather than accused. He'd put on a real performance for the jurors, giving them shocked when he'd found out that Bones had been kidnapping street kids, given that saddened when the police thought that he might have had something to do with it, giving them outrage when recounting how a rogue detective had been beaten with him to within an inch of his life. Hunter had watched the trial unfold with a growing sense of unease. Rebecca Finch was hotshot, a real go-getter, but while there was little doubt she was winning the battle, she hadn't yet won the war. Thus far, the prosecution had been hampered by the fact that all of Montero's associates had developed a sudden case of amnesia. Nobody had a bad word to say about Salvadorian. Nobody, that is, except Bones, the 300-pound pedophile who'd left more than that, enough evidence at the steelworks to seal his fate. Bones was the guy who had the most to gain from cutting a deal. Bones was up to next on the witness stand. The tide was about to turn.